Hello there everyone and welcome back. It is time to get into the meat of what I'm hoping to dive into as my next big adventure, my next big endeavor rather, into the foreseeable future. I kind of hinted at before with my previous videos recently of doing my, Warhammer 40k with Black Templar on Tabletop Simulator. I have been slowly trying to get an army all prepared for the newest release of Warhammer 40k, which is 10th edition. And with that said, I did play, 40k way back on 5th edition, I think it was, or at least the starter box was the Assault on Black Reach, for anyone who knows what edition that pretty much was, with Cato Sicarius and the Ultramarines kind of face off against some Goth orcs maybe, I can't quite remember what orcs it was. But that was the starter box at the very least, and that was how I initially got into 40k itself. I kind of got interested in the genre, the game, the world itself, thanks to Dawn of War and my excitement for playing around with the Tau primarily, and a lot of the other factions as well, but I eventually did drop out of 5th edition 40k, mainly because there was a lot of other Space Marine factions, so it was... The games I did play felt like it was a lot of mirror matches. Some other bad experiences, which I may emphasize or talk about a little bit as we go on throughout this series. And I think the Space Marines just weren't my type of faction there. For maybe a myriad of different reasons, but it's possible I might go back to them in time. We will see. But as I hinted already, I have been trying to get ready and get back into 10th edition with a new army. I was contemplating maybe originally going for Tau Force, but I think for the purposes of trying to have a good variety of different playstyles and things I could do, keep in mind when I made this decision for the faction I was going to play as, or at least focus on first, it was before 10th edition was even announced. I got back into it with my nephews roughly around Christmas time of 2022, for those who may be watching this video, after it's a publication, or after I released the video essentially. So I had a few months to get an army ready, get a combat patrol all set up, which is kind of convenient with how 10th edition works now, as I am going to be doing my recap of my very first tournament that I just stumbled upon basically. It was not attended, I did not even know there was a combat patrol going on, but thankfully I had an army already, even brought with me, for said tournament. And unfortunately, due to the fact that I was unprepared for this tournament, I only managed to get maybe 2 games in of the possible 3 or 4 that was going on for the actual day, for the actual evening. So this is not going to be an all-encompassing battle report as I would like. But I am still happy to unveil, well, maybe I'm kind of second-guessing a little bit because you'll understand what I mean, especially if you've been paying attention to 10th edition win rates and how factions are. I have been or at least I'm going to be going into this tournament with the Fatebreakers Eldari Combat Patrol Force. Like I hinted at before, I like the idea of Tau, but due to the fact that they were kind of primarily a shooting faction, I did not think that encompasses a lot of different variety of playstyles for me to kind of learn the nuances of the game and different tactics. And I want to go with Eldari Craft World because of course the lore, the theme, and they do have the means of getting aggressive, getting more up in their faces there, melee focus, if I so wished. Although with a 10th edition kind of emphasizing durability and vehicles and heavy monstrous creatures, that might not come to fruition, at least for the foreseeable future, but maybe there'll be a way. Maybe there's a method I could get some Howling Banshees or Striking Scorpions to do some work for me, as I continue to learn the nuances. But yeah, I have been working on Eldari Force. I have them pretty much quote-unquote battle ready, which basically means they have at the very least 3 different colors on the models to kind of make the matches kind of presentable. I think really the only thing I'm really missing on my force is, of course, the heirlooms, the accessories on them, and proper highlighting and shading to kind of have that depth and kind of spectacle you probably would like on the board. But otherwise, I'm relatively happy with the faction, and The main thing about combat patrols is you don't really have much customization or flexibility with how to build your army. It is quite literally what you get with the combat patrol boxes that are available for sale is what you're going to be using for these type of matches, which is roughly around 500 points for the sake of comparison. Since 40k games, the majority of the time, are either played at 1000 points or 2000 points, which is the majority of the big scale, the grand tournaments as I think they're called. So this is basically the force I'm going to be utilizing for this tournament. It involves a squad of 10 Guardian Defenders, which are basically just the militia, for lack of a better term. They are very well skilled, but they are the most expendable. Well, that's kind of a poor word to say if you know the Eldar lore, but they are kind of the cheapest, the most generic type of soldiers you can get. They don't have special abilities or anything like that, which almost all the specialized Eldari units kind of have. They just don't have any extra durability or armor, which makes them a very fragile force if you were to go with the elite troops as opposed to maybe the Guardians, for comparison's sake. And other than that, we have our Wraithlords, our big monstrous creature. Almost every single one of the combat patrols are going to have one monstrous creature or at least one very durable vehicle to kind of be the linchpin of controlling the middle of the map, essentially. They may not do a whole lot of damage depending on the weaponry they have to bear, but they're there to kind of soak the fire, be intimidating, and, in the case of Eldari, keep the rest of my units alive by drawing all the fire. And to kind of provide us map control and mobility, we have 6 Wind Riders, which presents only one of the real mobilities or flexibilities that the combat patrol has, in that you could choose to split them into 2 squads of 3, or if you want really powerful focus fire, then you can pair them all together into a single squad of 6, which I don't think there's any real benefit to that, but there might be, because some of the stratagems and other options you have available to you, which I'll talk about as the match goes, as I talk about this battle report, kind of allow you to select 2 different squads of a certain type, which are basically a resource you can spend to get bonuses for kind of very big plays, very big type of momentum swings if you think you can afford it. Like basically +1 to hit, making your shots much more accurate. Or like, what is it? Lightning fast reactions, which makes it harder for my units to get hit if they're getting focus fired down or if I leave them in an exposed position. And things like that. And then leading off this force is going to be my Farseer, which all the combat patrols have their own themes, so I don't think I'm going to go with the name. Yeah, because I basically have been naming my own Eldari already, so let me see if I can remember it quickly. I have it written down. Here we are. My Farseer representing this combat patrol is going to be Fate Scriber Ariel Delwyn. It's going to be fun. She doesn't have quite the powers and abilities that she would for the live 1000-point games, but a lot of that is because that's due to balancing to help make all these combat patrols kind of as balanced as possible. At least that's what GW Games Workshop have kind of proclaimed for their combat patrols. You kind of have set loadouts, you have set weaponry, as a perfect example with the Wraithlord only having a 1 heavy weapon as opposed to the possible 2 it can be equipped with. And the bike squad will only have 2 heavy weapons, while the rest have their generic anti-infantry type guns. To kind of give you an example of that. Whereas the Wraithlord could get more weaponry, more specialized guns, and the Wind Riders could all get heavy weapons if I so wished, as an example. And I am excited to see, or at least talk about, these 2 matches, because I think it wasn't too bad there. But with dice games, it can swing quite heavily if you don't have the right mindset or the right game state for when things start to go bad, or when things go amazingly in your favor. So let us get started. Now to start us off in round 1, it is going to be a classic match of Eldari Elves versus the Dwarves in the League of Vultan. And the League of Vultan don't technically have a monstrous vehicle or a tank of their own to bring this fight. Instead, their heavy hitters, their most powerful units, are actually going to be a squad of 3 bikes. And unfortunately, I was not able to get a nice close-up picture for the enjoyment of the battle report, mostly because I didn't think of it at the time. And they were kind of facing away from me from the angle it was at, so I didn't want to kind of intrude on my opponent too much there. Although both my opponents did allow me to take pictures, so I can happily present how the battle was laid out and of course talk about my mindset a little bit. Since primarily I want to use these reports as a kind of way to learn the nuances of the game, figure out what I did wrong, figure out what went right, and how to improve my play. And this is basically the result of our first match, at least the deployment zone. We are doing what I believe is called a Dawn of War deployment, where we go along, we set up our troops along the long end of the board, with 4 objectives in the middle of the map outside of our reach. At least just a little bit there. I think there's nothing fancy or special about these rules from what I'm aware of. I was caught ill-prepared, so I didn't really get much chance to prepare on secondary objectives, primary objectives, or even just the mission types in general, so I kind of had to rely on what my opponent told me and play it off of that at the very least. But the League of Votann, as you can imagine, are dwarves that are very resilient for what they have to offer. They can still die relatively quickly in comparison to some other factions, but they do have the toughness to at least take blows a lot better than most, as opposed to my elves that want to avoid direct confrontation whenever possible. And my dwarves and my dwarf adversary in this case have, of course, the 3 bikes I told you about, which are their most mobile units. They have 5 melee berserkers, which are in front of the bikes currently as per the deployment. And they have a squad of 10 dwarf gunners, regular infantrymen, with their leader and warlord leading half the squad. Their option apparently was to split them in half as one of their combat patrol choices, and both of them are deployed right in the middle there. And I decide to set up as much in the middle as I can, with the bikes on the side to allow for a little bit of flexibility, depending on how my opponent decides to play this. Since, just as to give you a general idea how this works, all those skull markers you see are the objectives, and at the start of our turns, we basically get 5 points for every objective we control at the start of our turn, which means we have to actually survive a round of shooting for us to get said points. To a maximum of 15. I don't think it's possible to get more than that, so if we're lucky enough to somehow get 15, or 3 points rather, then we get the max amount there. And then otherwise, we have a list of secondary objectives we could choose from for combat patrol, which is not really a thing you can do in the actual matches. There are like tactical objectives or a list of generic objectives, secondary objectives you can utilize to get points off of, but every faction has access to those. In the case of combat patrol, we have access to 2 secondary objectives unique to our factions. In this case, I decide to go with the secondary objective that I get 3 points if I can secure objective at the end of my turn that I did not originally control at the start. So it forces me to move around a lot and keep taking different points. For if I already have the points, then I'm either winning because I have multiples to begin with, or I'm trying to steal points from my opponent. And my League of Votann opponent, I may have missed this because I did not plan around it as a result of that, even though, to be fair, I don't think there's much I could do, considering I don't want to go bull rush it in. They basically get 4 victory points a turn if they are sitting on a designated objective. That's in no man's land, which is basically outside the deployment zone. I may have missed this possibly, but they declared the one that was directly in front of them for the purposes of this secondary. So it's pretty much the easiest 4 points they can get, and their infantry are almost already in range to grab it. But needless to say, we start off with deployments finish up as it is, and I get to go first for the turn order, which unfortunately, if I'm completely honest, I don't think I want, because again, I want to avoid confrontation. If I go first, I'm kind of forced to move forward, try to grab the points, and risk me getting exposed. So what I try and do is just try play conservative, move everything into the middle, my bike's on the side, basically try and move towards the middle to kind of get in position for a strafing run, while my other bikes that were starting in the middle try and do some long range harassment on the dwarf gunmen. And thankfully I do take out a couple of them. They are again toughness 5, I believe, in comparison to the toughness 3 of my Eldari, which basically means they're a lot more resilient to heavy weapon fire. At least the heavy anti-infantry weaponry, kind of like the scatter lasers, the heavy gun on my bikes. Because they are the exact strength 5 that I need, and basically, that just means it's a 50-50 chance to actually injure them, if I successfully hit the target. Whereas if it was against my elves or anything else weaker, then I have a much more reliable chance. I'll probably talk a little bit of the dice I need, but that adds a lot more complication than probably needed. But needless to say, their toughness is the same strength as a lot of my basic weaponry, if not tougher than my infantry weapons that my actual guardians actually have. Just to give an example, it makes them a lot more surprisingly resilient in this type of match, as opposed to many others. But yeah, I get a few light hits. My Wraith Lord sadly doesn't get too many shots on it. I think I had it and the bikes on the back take shots on the Berserkers and managed to wound a couple of them. Not much, but it is a starting blow. I don't know how to really gauge how effective it is, but I tried to play a very conservative mindset in preparation for whatever the League of Votann player has in mind. And sadly, I was not aware of their bike's ability, what they could do, although I don't think there was much I could do about it in the first turn, mind you. But at the end of my turns, before they get to go, if their bike squad is on the edge of the map, the sides of the map, not like on the edge of their deployment zone, I believe, then they are allowed to take them off the field and then redeploy them on another side of the map, whether it's the same side or on the opposite end. In which in this case they decide to just pop up right next to my bikes, since I didn't quite have the movement, I don't think, to effectively block it, or at least make that difficult for them to deploy, because they can only get within 9 inches. So if I had the movement and positioning, I could theoretically keep them from deploying their bikes in an ideal position to strike at my Wind Riders. But this is where their heavy firepower comes to bear and why they are the biggest powerhouses on the dwarf side. They have 3 different guns to them, and they just very easily obliterate my biker squads. They have a little bit extra toughness, but needless to say, with heavy shotgun firepower and other weaponry, they didn't really last very long, even with an ability that I attempted, or stratagem as it's called, to try and reduce the chance to get hit. It didn't amount to much. But thankfully I avoid the rest of the fire on for everyone else. They were kind of hidden behind cover, and then the next turn I try and get far more aggressive. At least with my bikes and my Wraith Lord. The Guardians kind of hang back there. I get points for a secondary objective, and of course I move on to the second point, since I have to get within 3 inches of that skull icon to kind of secure it. And the idea I had here is with one of my other stratagems, I was going to have the second bike squad shoot at the dwarves, and then kind of fall back behind the building to hopefully get a little bit of cover, which left me in an awkward predicament, which I'll have to think on a little bit. If the Wraith Lord should have gone all out on the dwarf squad in front of it, I think I bring them down to 2, thanks to the fire of my bikes and the Wraith Lord, which sadly, I don't think the Wraith Lord actually got a kill. It was almost all due to the work of the bike squad behind it. But 2 of them are left there from the 5 that originally started, and I contemplate maybe charging to get in melee and maybe wipe them out, but I thought better of it, because getting the points for the second objective, especially with it buffed up with Fortune, which basically puts a modifier, puts a little bit of a shield on it, makes it hard to wound. So if you need like a 4 to do damage to it potentially, you subtract that by 1 and you need to roll a 5. Substantially increasing its survivability, especially when it's out in the open, as you can see there. Those dwarves, while they may not seem intimidating for the Wraith Lord due to kind of anti-personnel weapon, they still have that one sniper rifle, that mag cannon, I think, on the one with the leader, the warlord, kind of leading them. That can still punch a nice hole in the Wraith Lord. Never mind the bikes are still present to take some shots at them if they think it's worth it. So I choose not to charge there, but there's a lot of nuances to think about. Since what I think happens if I do wipe out that squad, which I do have 8 attacks in melee, and every single one of them, if they're successful, can just straight up wipe out the dwarves if they successfully get through their armor. So there was a very good chance I could destroy the dwarves, and then what I think happens, I'm going to have to double check on a specific ruling. I think I'm allowed a 3-inch move, but I think the caveat is I have to move closer to an enemy unit or towards an objective marker. And the problem with that is, if I'm not within reach of the objective marker that I just moved from, then I would have no choice but to move point blank range of the warlord, which has a very powerful power fist, and I would not be able to take that objective, because keep in mind that entire dwarf squad is still on the objective, and I think they're able to still can hold that despite my construct still being there to kind of oppress them. So I thought it better to just hold my position, even though I would have loved to cause more kills. I think it was the better play, but I did not attempt to do some measurement and guessing to see if that was actually possible though, because I think it would have allowed me to fall back onto the objective if the 3-inch move was enough. That was probably the only failing there, but I think it may have been the right choice. After the fact, at least. Afterwards, the dwarves just rallied themselves there, get ready to take some shots on me, and the bike squad that took out my first bikers do decide to go and take the frustration out of my second bike squad. So they wipe out 2 of the 3 bikes this time. I figured being behind the building and behind the walls would give them cover, but apparently the bike squad actually have like some kind of special equipment that allows them to ignore benefits of cover, which essentially just increases my armor save, just as a simple way to apply that. But unlike before, they do survive. At least my heavy gun biker still survives, since I could choose which models get removed first. That's how that basically happened. So I still have a little bit of mobility, I still have a little bit of heavy infantry firepower, and in theory, I'm still in good shape, because I believe I only took 4 wounds on the Wraith Lord after the round of shooting that they had upon it, with both the heavy weaponry of the bike shooting at the Wraith Lord, and the infantry squads also shooting at the Wraith Lord. Otherwise, we move on over to turn 3. Most of these matches do go to turn 5, at least they're 5-turn games, but I kind of didn't get much of a picture of the bikes kind of flanking me. But I do show you what I have in mind for my follow-up turn 3, where the Wraith Lord attempts to charge onto and obliterate the bikes, at least attempts to. Although in reality, what actually happens is the Wraith Lord only kills 1 of the bikes, and even with a failed Bright Lance shot, which is basically my anti-tank gun on the top, I do no damage in melee, or at range rather, and it's really the melee charge with my blade that actually takes out 1 bike and then wounds another one essentially. So they are wounded, and the main idea here was to lock them into combat, so that way, unless they have a special rule, they should not be able to be a threat to anything else. And it also, as it turns out, which is what was the main reason I thought to do this, was that way they cannot redeploy onto the field and be a nuisance elsewhere. Which thankfully was the right play there. It just sadly wasn't the damage I was expecting. I was hoping to at least take out 2, but 1 gets annihilated and the other one's left over with 1 hit point, 1 wound remaining. And the bike with the heavy scatter laser, the heavy cannon, does manage to pick off the rest of that wounded dwarf squad, which in turn puts a grudge token, as per the dwarves' special rule, that makes them a lot easier to kill as a result, because the dwarves want vengeance. The dwarves want punishment for this wrong that they've been slight against them essentially. Otherwise, on the other end of the field, I do try to get a little more aggressive with my Guardian squad. I do expose myself quite a bit out in the field, but again, with my secondary objective and already having 2 points there in the middle of the map, I do try to make a play for a 3rd point, so that way I could keep the secondary point generation going, and hopefully secure 2 points at once here. it does make it very fragile because, again, my elves are not going to be very durable, as you're going to find out very quickly in comparison to how long it took me to take out just 5 dwarves. For after a round of shooting, after weakening their berserkers a bit more, they decide to do their counterattack on me, and they are not happy. Because apparently, the bikes were able to fall back, or at least my opponent declared, or said that they were able to fall back, and still shoot at me. Which, at the time, I was okay with, but after looking at the rules and everything like that, this honestly was not the case, which is a little bit unfortunate. And it's one of the many slights, the many things I'm going to have to get used to and understand with 40k in general as I play this game. Since I think where my opponent was thinking he could fall back and still shoot, falling back basically means disengaging from a melee engagement, which in this case was the Wraith Lord trying to murder him, because they were not very powerful in melee, so it stands to reason why they would want to run away. But in this case, there was an enhancement on the Warlord, which you can only put on your leader, that allows your squad, the bearer's unit is how it's worded, to fall back and still shoot and maybe charge. I'll have to double check that. Either way, this was not supposed to be able to be done on the bikes unless there's a stratagem. Maybe that's another thing. I'll double check that actually now for the sake of this discussion. Okay, having a look at that now, it did not seem that there was a stratagem of any kind for the full-time player to actually utilize, so, which is really unfortunate because that could have had a big impact with my Guardian surviving, because the fortune ability I used on my Wraith Lord, which is coming from the Farseer, which is something to keep in mind, I tried to put it on my Guardian squad in preparation for this move, but it's a 1 in 6 chance of it actually failing, and sadly I had to roll the 1 needed to fail the fortune, and as a result my Guardians were left wide open and completely exposed to the shooting to be had, which includes the bikes in this case. So just for keep that in mind, as every single one of my guys, every single one of my Guardians, except maybe one Guardian and the Farseer themselves, was left standing. It was a very brutal exchange. I think even the Berserkers had some wars to shoot on me. Oh yeah, never mind. I had used a stratagem called Overwatch to kind of wipe them out as they charged into melee range is what basically happened. But yeah, my squad was almost entirely wiped out, but thankfully I kept the Guardians alive to secure the 3rd objective and secure the points at the very least. And as a result of being below half strength, I was forced to roll what is called a battle shock or morale test, as it were, to see if I could use them still for securing objectives or not, basically. Because if I ever fail that morale roll, I essentially lose the ability to secure objectives for that turn. I am not able to use the stratagems to kind of defend myself, or even enhance my offensive capabilities with that squad. And there was one other thing I can't. Oh yeah, if I ever am forced to fall back like the bikes did with the Wraith Lord, then there is a severe risk of my units just immediately dying on the fallback attempt. There is some more risk to that. But needless to say, I did succeed there. That was not much of an issue. And going with the mindset that I did not have the starting objective I start with, I just moved on back over there for securing the secondary objective, and then tried to wipe out the bike with the Wraith Lord that did take a little bit of damage, or at least only took some grazing shots. The focus was primarily on the Guardian squad this turn, which is why the fortune would have been so useful. And they also wiped out my remaining bike as a result too. They split their fire just enough to actually take out both targets. And then the game just rapidly went into me just trying to get as many points as possible, while, unbeknownst to me, my opponent was gaining a bunch of points just for holding their 1 objective. But at the final turn, turn 5, my Wraith Lord was finally taken out, and not after taking out their bike squad and trying to do a little bit of pop shots on their the remaining infantry squad. So the game pretty much ended with the dwarves finally reaching on out to try and get a second point, and we basically have ourselves with a very close match with that said, although there are a few caveats which I will go into there. I'm not upset about this, but for the sake of just how the score truly was, how close the game actually ended, I think I could be pretty happy with it considering my inexperience with this game. I conveniently was able to get a picture of the score because my opponent was tracking on their app, so this is nice convenience there. But the score, at least for reporting it, was 51 to Votan and to 47 for me. And you can even see what the secondary and primary objective was. Take and hold was just getting the 5 points for holding the points in general, like I was doing. And the secondary objectives for us was invaluable agenda for me, and tolls earned, toll earned for the League of Votan. So that's pretty much it there. Regardless. Okay, maybe this is not as bad as I thought it was, because from what I could tell, both of us, it seems like, can get access to our secondary objectives on the first turn, but it seems like both me and my opponent didn't get access to that. My opponent told me I could not get invaluable agenda turn 1, but the app at least shows that we can have a cap of 15 and 20 respectively. So I think it was still possible there, but that would have made a slightly further deficit for me. But the main thing to keep in mind that I did not know about during this match, and apparently both my opponents were not aware of, is that there's a little feature in combat patrols to help make it, due to the fact that we only have like realistically 4 or 5 squads, and that you don't have to keep an infantry squad on the point to kind of control it. There's a phrase called sticky objectives. Once where you have an objective at the start of your turn, you basically will keep control of it until an opposing enemy unit, gets on the point and steals it from you essentially. Which honestly makes it really hard to tell how the game would ended off there. But theoretically, I basically had 2-3 points almost for a brief period of time there, where my Guardian squad, as an example, was kind of shot down and nearly wiped out. I still would have gotten 10 points there. The reason I didn't get 15 is because the bikes negated the points, the one that my Wraith Lord took from me, but they would not have gotten extra points there because my Wraith Lord immediately took it back once the bikes kind of flew away from me. Especially since there was only 1 bike remaining. If there were 2 bikes still alive when I charged them the second time, then that might not have been the case. But yeah, I feel like that would have made the match at least a lot more closer, but at the same time there's a bit of a gray area which I don't know how that would have affected my opponent's playstyle. If they would have genuinely have spread out and tried to go for a second point sooner, or if they would have just stuck with their current strategy. That's the only downside there, but considering how close the score was, just a 4-point difference, I think I am truly happy with that outcome, and I don't think there was too much different I could have done. Just the misfortune of having to fail that one fortune roll could have maybe kept a few of my Guardians alive, and as a result, basically just, would have gave me another 5 points with how the game currently played out if 2 or 3 more survived just to secure those 2 objectives on turn 4. And now for my second match, which is an unexpected result, possibly. We are going to be face off against in a mirror match against another combat patrol Eldari. And this is where things are still going to be a little bit different, a little bit interesting. Even though I don't know what the rules were for the tournament. Again, I was ill prepared for this, so I don't know if I'm locked into certain enhancements or formations, kind of like an example having my bikes as 2 separate squads as 3, or if I was allowed to merge them into 6, but before I had a stratagem that buffed up, my Warlord had an enhancement, kind of like how the Fultan Dwarf player had an enhancement to allow him to fall back and still shoot. In that Dwarf game, I had an enhancement that allows my Guardians to kind of shoot Overwatch whenever anyone got close to him on the opponent's turn, and have a very good chance actually doing damage with their shuriken weaponry, as it's called. And that is basically what happened for me to kill their melee berserkers, kind of eliminating the threat before they actually could get in close, essentially. But in this case, I chose to switch my enhancement over to the one that buffs up only my Warlord, my Farseer, with all his psychic abilities, essentially, since he is a psyker and not like a general in this match. So what it basically does is I get to re-roll anytime I roll a 1 for his psychic weaponry attack, which is basically a psychic lightning storm that he shoots on a group of enemy units. And his spear is also a psychic weapon too, which primarily is melee, but it can be thrown at a target to do some good damage at range too. So basically, whenever I'm attacking with these weapons on the Farseer only, sadly, I am allowed to reroll 1s, which, considering my Farseer can hit on 3s, and depending on the toughness of my target, he can still wound on 3s, maybe even 2, with the power of his storm. That is very useful because it's pretty dang close to rerolling almost all my failed saves, almost all my dice that failed to hit the target. And I even get to reroll 1s for damage, which I think is really important, considering the bikes have at least 2 hit points. So if I roll a 1 there for doing damage to him, then I'm allowed to reroll that. It even allows me to do that there. It's pretty useful, and the main reason I took it was as a backup to possibly do damage to my opponent's Wraith Lord, should my own Wraith Lord kind of not be up to the challenge of doing the damage. Because sadly, even though it did eventually wipe out most of the bikes, the Bright Lance, the big anti-tank weaponry on his shoulder, did not even hit once, and the anti-personnel gun barely did any damage. It was really just its melee attacks, which potentially was underwhelming still, considering it was only destroying 1 bike a turn. And I don't even think it wiped out the bikes completely. I think that was more my Farseer doing that when I hid behind cover. But either way, my opponent got to deploy and go first for this board. So I basically just tried to mimic them as much as possible, with the exception of placing down my Wraith Lord in kind of a position where I could either shoot at the bikes, and maybe, just maybe, although I did not expect to be able to shoot the Wraith Lord because the central building kind of was obscurant, it would just come down to where my opponent would try and move the Wraith Lord. But as it turns out, the Wraith Lord was not within... I was not able to shoot at said Wraith Lord at all. It was close enough to the building it was completely obscured. So after taking a little bit of grazing shots on my Guardian, which sadly I didn't have an opportunity to kind of give him the fortune or get any kind of buffs from my Farseer, like I did before with the dwarves, because I still have to get my turn going before I'm allowed to roll forward a said fortune buff. But I took very light damage. It wasn't very imposing because thankfully I had cover to help weather a lot of the damage. And my retaliatory fire was pretty dang good. I take out half the bike squads, which my opponent had them all together in one squad, which can be really good here, as it minimizes the risk of overkilling them if I hit them with everything. And in this case, I took out half them thanks to the Eldritch Storm of my Farseer, and sadly my Wraith Lord didn't really do anything there. Once more, I failed to hit with the Bright Lance, which being a lumbering construct, it actually has worse chance to hit, at least in comparison to my bike squad. It's there to be a brute and not really a damage dealer. So it would seem, at least, so far as my impression with it failing. But the bike squad tries to take some light shots on their guardians there that are holding the point behind the wall, and I use my stratagem to kind of just fall back and re-secure the point. Because again, there was a special rule to just, even if you aren't on the point, you still technically have control of it. But even my opponent here was not aware of that rule, so we were playing on that fact, essentially, that we still had to be on the point. So after my bike shot, I was allowed to pull him back about 6 inches, about half their movement, and that was enough to still be within the point to potentially get 10 victory points. Which is convenient because my opponent decided not to do that on their end. So the bikes were not close enough to the center objective, and my opponent only managed to get 5 points, plus the extra 3 for the secondary objective. But needless to say, my opponent still pushes forward, the bikes jump onto the center objective, and this forces me to do a couple of things. One, either try and get some units onto the point itself, and just brute force them off through sheer numbers. Because based on certain stats, there's a statistic on each of the units called objective control. You basically add these together based on the number of units that are on said objective to essentially determine who owns the point for the sake of scoring. In this case, if my Wraith Lord was going to charge in there into melee and fight said Wraith Lord, try and take the point rather, I would need to take out at least 2 of the Wind Riders to make it possible. However, if the squad gets entirely wiped out because my Wraith Lord is not able to get close enough to be considered taking the point, because I believe you have to be within 3 inches, and we talked about this before I made the maneuver. My opponent said I would have to be on the roof to actually get the objective, because it's about 3 inches downward, which we deduced, or at least we both commonly agreed on, would not have counted, which meant the same for his Wraith Lord as well there, as I attempted my shots, and I failed to kill even one of these bikes. I did not kill a single one of them there, and the kicker is I chose not to do my attacks with my Farseer, because, again, I was fearing overkilling the targets, because I had a big star cannon which could potentially blow up a bike in a single shot, and it had multiple shots to kind of help increase the chances of that. And never mind, my Wraith Lord had big, heavy weaponry to kind of blow them up as well. I think he almost completely negated their armor, no less, but I was forced to charge into the full squad completely unhindered, and the disappointment would continue as I not only did I fail to get a single hit in with the sword attacks, all 8 of my sword attacks, but the bikes were able to injure my Wraith Lord in return. It was only 1 point of damage, mind you, but still, it's the ultimate insult for something that I rely so heavily on, considering how this match is potentially going to play out. Because now, my Wraith Lord is kind of stuck in the fight there, and their Wraith Lord is within perfect striking range to do a counterattack. Because how melee combat normally works, at least as far as charging is concerned, you gain an ability called Fights First if you charge, which basically means you always will do the first strike, unless your opponent has the Fight First too, in which case, the opponent whose turn it isn't, well, the opposing player who's not actually going on that turn gets to do their attacks first, I believe. And in a kind of what would be the term? Every single one of our units were fighting melee, essentially. It would go back and forth between us, depending on who was allowed to fight, as an example. So in this case, only his Wraith Lord would get to fight us, and then if the rest of the squads were still stuck in melee for some reason, then it would bounce between us, starting with me, after all the fight first characters go. I hope that wasn't too confusing, I apologize. I'm trying to explain this without trying not to get too descriptive on the stats and all that, because there's a lot to take under the hood, essentially, with like stats, toughness, strength, all the different weaponry and data sheets to them, and so on. Needless to say, though, I do my maneuver shooting at the Guardian squads again with the bikes as well, but I completely forgot about using my stratagem to kind of do another fallback and shoot like I did before somehow. Probably a lot of it due to the fact I was so distraught from how badly trying to kill the Wind Riders turned out. And it's going to cost me very badly there, whereas the Wraith Lord comes up, charges me, and then just immediately one-shots my Wraith Lord. To give you an example, the Wraith Lord has about 10 hit points normally. I did take 1 wound, but after 2 of his hits managed to get through my armor, he rolls the dice to see how much damage it does. So it's like a max of 6 damage per strike, essentially. And he got 2 of them in. He got the max 12 damage he needed to just immediately destroy my poor Wraith Lord. And I don't think I need to tell you how quickly this is going to snowball out of control, as I am kind of forced to play a desperation to deny him off the points with lacking firepower from now on, as I only do some grazing damage onto the Wraith Lord with my Star Cannon and Farseer, and I still fail to take out the Wind Riders. Meanwhile, my Wind Riders in the back are still slowly getting pummeled down, but they are still slightly standing. I think I was down to maybe 2-ish scatter lasers at this point. I lost 1 after turn 2, and then I lost 2 more after the 3rd round where I failed to kind of fall back on him in the counter shots, which made it a little bit easier for him to shoot at me, which is the main reason for that happening, I think, since I was still within range of his Farseer's Eldritch Storm, as it's called. So I make one last desperate play. It does not pan out, and the strands of fate did not favor me in this case, so it rapidly turns into a concede there, with me only having a measly 18 points. 5 for to begin with, 3 for grabbing an objective in no man's land, and then gain 10 points for that one turn I had 2 objectives essentially. Well, technically I had 23 because I was still on the point for turn 3. But this was quite the rout. It was definitely disheartening with how underwhelming my Wraith Lord performed. At least as opposed to their Wraith Lord. They just completely demolished me, and there was still a good chance, a really good chance for my Wraith Lord to at least survive one turn and get a counterattack in. Basically what would have happened, yeah, just to give you statistics there, if we gone for our big mighty strikes, our two-handed strikes essentially, that's more powerful but gives us less attacks, that would be 4 dice, I believe, for representing 4 attacks. There's a 50-50 chance to hit, and then based on the chance to wound, I think you need to roll like 5s, if I remember correctly, because I don't think the strength was high enough to succeed the toughness. So they have a penalty for trying to injure us. And they got the 2 wounds they needed, and a ridiculous amount of damage to just completely destroy my Wraith Lord. Because otherwise I would have had a nice counterattack, get an opportunity to at least cripple it, so maybe my Guardians could have destroyed it afterwards, but they both would have been locked in combat. That would have been a little bit tricky to do, I think. Even if there is a way for me to do some damage to the Wraith Lord still, it does come down to how that next third turn of melee combat would perform. Because as I hinted at, I think his Wraith Lord would have got to attack before mine, since both of them were already locked in combat at the start of my turn. So I think I was doomed either way just because I chose to charge the bikes as opposed to charging the Wraith Lord. Which I probably could have charged the Wraith Lord due to how close we were. It just seemed like the bikes were the more pressing target, as I would have stole the objective from him, get the secondary objective bonus as well for that, and it sadly did not pan out. And either way, it probably would not have worked all against the Wraith Lord either, judging by the fact I did absolutely no damage. It was still a fun time. It was a starting point to get into 40k at the very least. I'm ultimately really happy with it. It's just a matter of how I could have done things better, especially with all the rules that kind of were forgotten about, although thankfully it wasn't just me who was kind of ill prepared or at least forgot about most of the rules. It was just disappointing after the fact with the dwarf game due to the fact that the bikes should not have been able to shoot me not just once but on 2 separate turns, and they pretty much were the reason why my Guardians took as much damage as they did, more than likely. But hopefully this was not a long-winded rant about the tournament and how things were for me there, and hopefully you did enjoy it. Hopefully as I get more used to this game, get more experience in it, and get into bigger matches, hopefully the production and the quality of the games, or at least going over these matches, will be a lot better. Because this can be kind of tricky to appreciate with only still images, because after all, it is a tabletop game after all. It's not like an actual video game where we can watch things happen at nice 60 frames. But I thank you all for listening if you managed to watch through all the way to the end, and hopefully I'll get some more matches in both with Black Templar in the foreseeable future on Tabletop Simulator, and just with my Eldari army and any other army I build in the future. I will see you next time.